Well, what if we take this model, pick the top 2% of the companies coming to Softeq that need help and don't have the funding, but don't just write them a check, put them into a studio program where we can provide the mentorship instead of just throwing money over the wall.
Sure.
And then pair them with our engineers that have been building products for the Intels and Compaqs and HPs of the world for the last 27 years to get their POC built, their MVP built, or get their hardware or software more enterprise ready. Extending our full stack services to funding and mentorship and creating a startup development engine. And this is something that I thought that didn't really exist here in Houston.
Well, Chris, 27 years is an amazing feat. I don't know what the numbers are, but I think 5 was like 91 or 2% survival or failure rate. At 27 years has got to be like, 99% failure rate. So congratulations on that.
Thank you.
In its own. The next thing that you've done that's just amazing, is how do you then transition that into an entire venture fund?
For me, I think it is part of the journey, right, of entrepreneurship and a cycle that I can see that we really want to try to build in Houston. So as an entrepreneur in Houston, I just saw that there was a lack of, I'll say, support for entrepreneurship, going back 40 years. And even like 5 years ago, there really wasn't a lot here as far as startup development organizations, et cetera. So when I first got started, in order to try to learn about business, the only thing that was around was SCORE, which is the Society of Retired Executives. And so you'd get like a, copied pamphlet and that would tell you about what the difference between a sole proprietorship was and a corporation, right? But over the years, it just, working with a lot of the West Coast companies in Silicon Valley, just saw what was going on there versus what was available here in Houston. And being an entrepreneur here, people would say, "Oh, you must know a lot of startup founders." And I'm like, "Well, no, I don't really. I don't even know where you would find them. Where are they?" Right? We all have our heads down. We're all trying to build businesses, but there wasn't anywhere that, you could go and meet people with. And so tried to get more plugged into the community in order to try to solve that problem. So once I had a partial exit at Softeq, at some point we had built a team up in Belarus for flash firmware development. And it was, at that point in time, it was for SK Hynix. They're the largest DRAM manufacturer in the world. They're the third largest conglomerate in Korea. So you have, Samsung and LG. So SK Hynix was number 3. And we had a dedicated team for them, and they wanted to acquire the team. And so I essentially split off half of Softeq, created a company called Softeq Flash, and then sold that business to SK Hynix. It was the first acquisition of a Belarus company by a Korean company.
Okay.
Right? And so it was interesting how many people came out and claimed credit for that. Nice. that they facilitated that. But that allowed me to have some money to act. I didn't have to sell Softeq. I sold a team, and now I could reinvest money into Softeq, and then I had money to invest in other things, right? And so I thought, well, I want to learn more about investing, as an angel investor.
Okay.
And I didn't want to just park my money over at Merrill Lynch or something, right? And so I did some of that, of course, but I want to take some funds and start investing in startups.
We still love Merrill Lynch, thoh.
Yeah, we do.
And maybe they want to sponsor us.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay.
Sponsorship opportunities do exist.
All right.
And so, I wanted to learn about angel investing. I got on AngelList. I started, following Jason Calacanis and his launch network, started participating in his syndicates, which allowed you to have, here's a deal they think is investable, and seeing their deal memos and being able to put, $5K into a deal or $10K into a deal. And then also even started doing some direct investments myself, which, larger checks, like a $25K check, usually you can't put $5K into a company because they don't want you on the cap table, right? But for $25K, they'll put you on. And just started, how I approached entrepreneurship in the past for myself. How do I learn here? Well, you learn by doing. And so I made a number of investments that way. And that was fine, but it was all like West Coast companies. And I couldn't really actually help these businesses, as much as I would want to, like here in Houston. And so I set out trying to get more plugged in. What's going on here? Right. And so this is around the time Station Houston started. And so that's when I met JR. And, we started to, show up at those events and sponsor and try to get more plugged into the network of what's going on here and how Softeq could actually help and give back. And so what I saw a need of was, well, where do you get funding for one thing, and then two, where's the mentorship coming from, and then leveraging a services business that I've built, right? So we had a lot of startups coming to Softeq with great ideas but no funding. Right.
Okay.
And so if they had funding, great, we can build this for you. If they didn't have funding, we'd say, well, go get some money, come back, and we'll help you. And so I started doing some angel investing on those businesses, and that actually was working out pretty well. One of the first ones was for a dog collar company called Halo Collar.
It's been on the show.
It has been on the show.
Yeah.
Ken's been here. So I think I put about $250K total or more into their company when they were just starting out. And started, partnering with them to build the business. And after, I think 4 years, they raised at a $400 million valuation, right? And so, and they've sold 200,000 dog collars. And so we have a team of engineers working just for them, right? And so well, what if we take this model, pick the top 2% of the companies coming to Softeq that need help and don't have the funding, but don't just write them a check, put them into a studio program where we can provide the mentorship instead of just throwing money over the wall.
Sure.
And then pair them with our engineers that have been building products for the, Intels and Compaqs and HPs of the world for the last 27 years to get their POC built, their MVP built, or get their hardware or software more enterprise ready. Extending our full stack services to funding and mentorship and creating a startup development engine. And this is something that I thought that didn't really exist here in Houston and set out to build.
So it came from the success you saw as an angel investor, especially mixing in with the services company, just on a much bigger scale, right? So where are we at today? When did the venture fund officially and studio officially kick off?
Yeah.
How many companies have you invested in?
Sure. So we started out with, again, iterating, right? So we picked 5 startups and I funded them myself and created a studio program of a cohort of 5 businesses. And once we saw that we could attract startups into our model, that they would actually give us equity for what we're trying to do, and that we could pull off a program, right? We thought, well, the next step is let's raise a venture fund, right? And use not just my money, but other people's money, and help investors invest in the startups and de-risk the investment for family offices and high net worth individuals that want to get access to the, say the technical, VC asset class, right? And Softeq de-risking it from the standpoint that we understand the technology, and by pairing these engineers with our development engineers, you essentially have a 400-person company on the startup that are trying to get a product built. And so we thought, well, let's raise a $40 million fund. And with a $40 million fund, we could put roughly 120 companies through with about half of the money. The other half of them would be for follow-on investments. So any of the winners that were coming out of the studio, we could do follow-on and say, okay, now this is really something that we're going to put money into. Right. And so we've done 5 cohorts now, 64 companies in the last roughly 18 months. And, so far so good.
So what's the typical investment as I go through the cohort?
Yeah, so for studio participation, the standard deal is about 6% of common stock in the startup for coming into the studio, which is very similar to a Techstars or a Y Combinator.
Okay.
I think they're even higher at those. And then we give them a convertible note of $125K that's typically split 50K in cash and 75K in services, right? And that's the standard deal. But we also get a lot of companies that are, pretty mature. I mean, the surprising thing to me is that we've pulled in companies worldwide. In our last cohort, we had from Israel, from Kenya, from Mexico, from West Coast, from East Coast. They're not all just Houston companies. And I guess the power of Google, right? They find us, and if they're a good fit for us, if they're a company that we can impact through our entrepreneurial experience or our software and hardware expertise, then that's the type of company we would bring in. I mean, if you're a CPG company, we're not gonna be able to help you unless you need an app for that. But the company from Mexico, they figure out how to do measure blood glucose with light. right? The company in Israel they've got a urinalysis product. They don't all have hardware. About 10% of the companies have some hardware associated with it. Others are, pure B2B, SaaS style businesses that we're helping them build their front or back end.
I was going to comment on that. You've also achieved tremendous amount of diversity in the founders. So is that on purpose or is it just natural? Where's that from?
Well, I think that diversity works, when you don't get in the way of diversity, right? So Houston is one of the most diverse cities in the United States. And so it would make sense that our cohorts are also diverse, right? So as long as you're not excluding people, you end up with a pretty diverse portfolio. And so I'm happy to say that, our diversity, stats are actually, really great. And again, you're pulling in from worldwide, right? So, African startups, Israeli startups, Canada startups, and then startups here in the Houston ecosystem, probably roughly half of the companies come from, say, Texas or Houston area.
What were some of the lessons learned? Starting a venture fund is no small feat. You're a emerging fund on fund number one and a studio at the same time because, it wasn't simple enough just to start a venture fund. What are some of the surprises, some of the gotchas, some of the things you've learned?
Well, there's definitely a lot of things to learn. And actually, it's much, much more complicated than a traditional venture fund. So like a $40 to $50 million fund like ours, a normal fund would make investments in 10 to 20 companies. And so there'd be 10 or 20 checks, right? So for us, we're actually 120 companies is the target, right? We've done 64 so far, which means it's an LOI. It's an SPA, stock purchase agreement. There's a convertible note. There's an MSA for the software services. There's an SOW. There's 5 contracts and then multiple transactions per company because the development service invoices and things. So you end up having maybe 10 transactions per startup and you have 64 companies and 600. So it's an order, 10x order of magnitude more complicated. And you're right, you're running a studio on top of it, right? And so there's a lot of moving parts. I like to say, and I enjoy a challenge, and it's definitely been a challenge. It's been the worst time to raise an emerging fund in 10 years, so that's been a lesson learned. Convincing people to, write, $100,000 checks or $1 million checks into a fund that, they know that you're, a first-time manager is definitely a challenge. Although the statistics show that the returns on smaller funds and emerging funds are actually 5x, generally, or at least the potential to reach that is a higher potential than like a larger fund. So in my opinion, a fund like ours is something that an investor really, should be interested in, right?
One thing I really love as an entrepreneur in Houston and how we met originally, I was acting as an advisor and interim CFO for a company that went through cohort number 2, which is Kodiak, and highly technical concept. I'm not even going to attempt to explain it to you here or anybody because it's tough for anybody to get their heads around. I brought them to every private office I knew in town and out of town to help try to raise money for them. And it was impossible because, you had to understand software and also be in investing. And there's just not much of that. What's out there from pre-seed and friends and family till when you're ready to go talk to Blair at Mercury Fund is a huge gap, especially in Houston. So when I came across the fund and got Kodiak into the 2, I'm like, man, this is amazing. It's the perfect stepping stone for a tech company in Houston to get from here to being ready for a real Series A, either in Texas or East or West Coast. So first, thank you for that and putting that together. How do you see the next steps of the fund, and what are you thinking about in the ecosystem? Because it's not just the fund, but how is Chris and the fund and Softeq impacting the whole ecosystem?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's still a lot to build here because people talk about the flywheel. We see even with investing at a pre-seed or seed level that there is like a desert to get from pre-seed to even Series A. And so we're also looking at like, well, maybe we need to have a model where we provide even ourselves some additional like bridge financing in order to keep these seedlings alive until they get to the point to where they can actually then grow and expand, and get the Mercury funds and other VC funds here in Houston interested in investing in those businesses, and really mapping out this system of who's investing in pre-seed, who's in A, B, C rounds, and who should you go to. It's almost like creating a hitchhiker's guide to Houston, right? And I still feel like I don't even understand all of those players, so we can connect those dots, because we need to get the companies all the way from when they plant the seed and we get their MVPs built, and then they need to get that additional, they need to survive, they need to get that funding, they need to get those clients, and they need to know where to go to get the next round of funding. And then we don't want them to have to go somewhere else to go get it, because then, now they're going to grow and exit in another region and not be around here. We want them to build their businesses, create those millionaires, have that exit. So those guys become the next angel investors, or those are the ones that start the next level of businesses. And this actually happened way in the past. Like if you think about back in the days of Compact, maybe the one and only unicorn here in Houston, hopefully not the only one, but they got their funding and they were able to stay here in Houston without relocating. And then, Rod Canyon going off to then help start things like the Houston Angel Network and start, HTC and try to, Goose Capital and all of these, tools and organizations that founders and developers could use in order to grow their business. But it was great to get that going, but it hasn't been quite enough yet, right? And so we need companies like Cart to stay here, grow, exit, and then feed back into the ecosystem, right? And and then also educating the there's a lot of money in Houston and Dallas and Texas in general, but a lot of it's going to traditional things like retail and oil and gas. Or I always joke about how everyone was more ready to throw money in a hole in the ground than they are to throw in a tech business, because they don't really understand the tech, and they understand like, oh, there's maybe oil down there and I can make money that way. And how do we get the family offices more comfortable with investing in, tech businesses, even though they've seen the results of Silicon Valley and, the amount of returns you can get by having a first check into somebody like Google. Right.
Well, you're given a platform for it, and we'll put Remington and Mike and Joe who've been on the podcast recently. The weight's on their shoulders. They're all doing amazing, and many more that have to then will feed back. And we know them well, and they will. That flywheel is definitely speeding up. I've seen it change just in the Rice ecosystem and the Houston ecosystem, and now you're given a platform to anybody. So I'll ask the traditional question: how are you, Chris Howard, helping forge the future?
Well, I think that by doing this, right, providing a platform where startups can get funding, can get mentorship, and get engineering services all here in Houston. And for a long time, Softeq was a best kept secret. No one knew we were here and that there was a company that could actually do software development, do hardware development here right in town, right? You don't have to go to India to find resources. And then also just trying to help educate people through like the podcast, for example. Who are the players in Houston? What are they working on? How do we connect the dots in order to help build this startup ecosystem and create these future unicorns? And so like these 60 to 100 companies that we're putting through the studio are going to grow, and hopefully some of those will be part of that flywheel and
not hopefully
and keep that going. So
they're out there getting after it. Well, thank you for everything you do, impacting the ecosystem, and I love the podcast. As we have tradition, we have socks.
Oh, wow,
I got to
great.
pick them out myself. These are your classic pie socks.
There we go.
For two reasons. One, pies are delicious.
That's right.
And two, pi is a number that every nerd loves.
Right.
So from one nerd to another, there's your pie socks.
Well, thank you. Well, thanks for pulling host duty.
Yeah.
This is one of the easier ones that I had to do. I knew all the answers.
Well, I learned a lot, and thanks for coming out.
Yeah, thanks, Greg.